If you guys have been following my reactions to Sseth videos, you know that not once has he played a game that makes even a little bit of sense to me. I'm sure this will be no different. This is Highfleet review, Photosensitive Seizure Edition. Let's do it.
Hey people, epilepsy warning. I'm serious. You have about 3 seconds. Now that all the epileptics are either dead or convulsing, let's have a pleasant time. Highfleet is self-described as a fleet carrier sim, programmed entirely inside an ice fishing shack by a single Russian man.
Oh God, I'm just going to point this out, that the Russians are people known for drinking. If you look up the life expectancy of a male in Russia, it's like 55 or something, right? And the alcoholism rate is through the roof. And I think the result of all of that, well, I'm not sure exactly, but I think it shows up in weird kind of dark ways. I think of Escape from Tarkov as being a classic example of this. A game which is dark, extremely challenging, incredibly unhelpful, right? And maybe that is something like the Russian experience, where it's just like everywhere is frozen tundra. No one will tell you how to survive here, and yet you must do it. I also want to point out in here, right, if you can see it, he's got a copy of Twilight Struggle. For those of you that don't know, Twilight Struggle is a massive board game for grown-ups designed by 2 graduates from my alma mater, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, right? Allegedly one of the premier international relations programs in the country. And Twilight Struggle is where you fight the entire Cold War on a board game. I think it takes hours. So right there is telling me that this is going to get weird.
Personally, I describe it as an immersive trauma sim, because the hardest part isn't the combat, it's staying calm when all your senses are drowned out by the scream of gunfire. The game takes place on the fictional desert planet of Kazakhstan. After a messy political revolution, rebel forces have taken over. You play as Grand Duke Mark Sayati Solemsky, who is tasked by the Russian Emperor himself, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, to restore order. Unfortunately, our forces to the south got glassed by thermonuclear warheads, so you could say it's not going too well. Our last-ditch effort is to push north towards the rebel-controlled city of Khiva.
Okay, I just want to point out this weird interface, right? There is almost no electronic screens here. There's one here on the top right. But other than that, this is like some sort of like Soviet era, like 70s or 80s. I mean, look, there's a compass and a protractor. Like you're going to be doing some artillery fire calculations on paper maps. There's hardwired switches. Like, again, you're in a Cold War era bomber. Okay, so this is just pretty strange, but let's keep going.
Objective, a plutonium reactor the size of a city, responsible for the vast majority of power generation across the planet. The hope is, once we capture it, the enemy will have to surrender, or at least negotiate a truce. However, you're vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and flat out broke. But first, let's get to the controls. Your word of the day, skeuomorphism. Every part of a UI looks like the real-world equivalent of what it's meant to represent. On the map, you're looking top-down from the cockpit, which is crammed with whatever communications devices you've got installed. This may look overwhelming, but compared to an actual Soviet cockpit, it's comparatively simple.
That is a extremely low bar. Actually, I'm going to say this. Okay, so the Soviet technology was actually designed to be exported. Almost all of it. There were some things that were only going to stay in-house, advanced anti-air systems, obviously ICBMs, but a lot of the rest of it, right, fighter aircraft, weapon systems, this was meant to be used by conscripts who would have a limited amount of training, in the case of like small arms and stuff, or like infantry type equipment, and then, or by a variety of different forces. So you could, there was an expectation that, say, Soviet MiGs would be used by the North Vietnamese, which I think they kind of were, but I think it was mostly Soviet pilots. But the idea was that it would be accessible to a wide variety of people. So actually, it's supposedly, though I can't vet this, that the interfaces and cockpits were actually really, really accessible. They were meant to be kind of idiot-proof.
Generally, if you make visual contact, it's already too late. The enemy has already spotted our chemtrail, so there's no point acting innocent, which is why we use all of this shit. At the top left, you've got your radar. Reliable, accurate, and high resolution. The good radar, also known as the overpriced radar, has a range of 700 kilometers. Check this out. Not only does it locate, but if I make contact, mark it on the map, and maintain course for exactly an hour, I can mark the new position, take a ruler between the 2 points, and find out the velocity and bearing of a signal. But you have to send radio signal to receive it, which means if you see them, they can definitely see you. So sometimes the best option is to turn it off and start panicking.
Thermal signature detected.
Unfortunately,
Okay, this is actually kind of cool.
this sound means our infrared search and track system is working correctly. What does this mean? It means there's a ballistic missile coming towards us, and since infrared is low range at 300 kilometers, it also means brace yourself.
Missile away.
In contrast, electronic intelligence, or ELINT, works off passive
That's actually the ELINT acronym. That's correct.
radar emission, so it's undetectable, long range, and looks like a fucking pretend phone for kids. It's very intuitive. I look at it, see the flashing red light which says alert, danger close, and I look away, trying to guess whatever the hell that means. Then there is the radar jammer. You can click it for stress relief, because it doesn't do anything. Imagine getting shot dead in a street, an experience that many Americans can relate
Jesus, bro. Jesus.
to. But as the bullet approaches, you can briefly become invisible. This amazing ability allows you to sneak away from the approaching bullet. However, the only problem is that bullets are typically much faster. Finally, you've got the radio, which intercepts radio transmission in real time. You'll have to dial in the correct frequency, tune the signal, and get a bearing on its direction. You only get a short window of time to do this before you lose the transmission. Even if you get it,
Yeah, wow. This is actually incredibly realistic to like Cold War era naval and air warfare. This is almost exactly what that would be like, right? You had a bunch of systems that were relatively new, that were all sort of emerging technology at varying levels, and you had to integrate them to make everything sort of work together. If you watched my Halo Wars video, I talked about exactly the problem that Seth's encountering here, and that is that, well, it requires a whole staff to run these things. And this is actually true. A real carrier would have one person who was doing nothing but running the ELINT, nothing but running the radar, and that they would be providing you this information distilled down into something like, you know, enemy detected or possible radar contact, this bearing, this distance, right? And you hear them from a couple of people, right? And you as the captain only have to understand what the enemy might be thinking and what you should be reacting to. So this is a role that should be performed by a staff of bridge officers, not just one dude clicking through an interface.
surprise, it's usually encrypted. Even if you decrypt it, surprise, it's literally a trucker asking for gas.
What is up with the truckers?
Every single time. The tactical knowledge of where every trucker stops to urinate is vital to the success of your campaign. There's also some other keys to the top right. Those are buttons to commit war crimes, and if you flick the switch, you can control the number of atrocities you'd like to commit. Finally, I can actually talk about the game. In this game, modern warfare has done away with tanks and aviation. Instead, we fly gigantic 30,000-ton blocks of steel, which guzzle 2,000 cubic tons of pressurized methane every 1,000 kilometers, with a carbon emission rating between who cares and it's probably gonna get warmer. Every ship is unique and complementary to the rest of your fleet.
Okay, that's pretty great. Pressurized methane, though. Yeah, this is the world in which there's a lot of methane for some reason, and global warming is not a factor.
Which you pick at the start of a campaign. Every ship piece is modular, which can be swapped out and modified as you see fit. There's no safety or hand-holding, so by all means, detach the bridge from your flagship, tumble to your death, and lose the game. But if you can resist the urge of destroying or selling your flagship, we should get moving, because it's only a matter of time before some Soviet babushka alerts the authorities. So start your...
That's another annoying reality, is that, man, people just People are always diming you out. Like, that's really what happens. That we used to call it ANN, the Afghan News Network, just the rumor mill of Afghans. They would tell you everything about your own operations. We heard the best debriefs of our own stuff from rando Afghan farmers who weren't there. They're like, oh yes, my cousin saw you patrol through, Gani Kale yesterday. They said the children enjoyed throwing rocks at you. And you're just like, what the F? Why don't you tell them to stop?
Your engines and pick a destination. Whatever your choice, expect heavy resistance. To make matters more complicated, you can't just send your flagship, because it's a fat, heavy piece of shit that tops out at 90 kilometers an hour. Why is this an issue? Because the enemy will spot us, raise the alarm, and send every strike fleet to our location. Pro tip, if you start hearing this music, you're already dead, which is why I usually...
That's actually a real thing for carrier groups. Carriers operate as, carrier groups. And the idea is that you have basically rings and rings and rings of protection around that carrier. And the physical ships themselves are the final ring. Normally, it's protected by, obviously, electronic warfare, defensive missile systems, anti-rocket guns. By the time you get to a carrier, you have to penetrate a lot of rings of defense. That said, not impossible. There's always someone trying to figure out a way to destroy carrier strike groups because, frankly, if you could take those out, you've taken out the largest single source of U.S. military power.
Usually just dismantle my flagship into a 2x2 cardboard box and fly it into the desert. I can't lose if I can't be found. So instead, we send a strike group ahead of the main fleet to kill everyone before they can scream for help. Combat is very simple. You take your diazepam, stare at the drywall for 10 minutes, and return to the PC. Then watch as you get locked on by 3 different ships. It's a trial by fire, but eventually you'll get the hang of it.
Okay, these graphics are actually not bad.
Typically, you fill your magazine, unload on the enemy, and try to live long enough to reload. And yes, you always fight 1v3. Get used to it. And yes, depending on the weather and time of day, you're going to see a lot of rain. Conversely, you're not going to see much else. Think of every ship in this game as a crab. Punch through its exoskeleton, and there's nothing but soft, tender flesh. The slightest crack in its armor, the slightest puncture in its crusty, and you'll devour the whole thing. There's a structural diagram of whatever ship you're targeting on the bottom right. You can use this to figure out the weak points of any high-altitude crustacean. Fun fact, pressurized methane is very explosive.
Yeah, that sounds extremely, recklessly, dangerously explosive. Reason it's probably a terrible fuel source. Which is kind of fascinating that the most realistic part is that all electricity is powered by one city-sized nuclear plant, which isn't actually the worst idea I've ever heard since nuclear power is both clean and renewable, or mostly renewable, and is definitely one of the cleanest sources of power, and crucially, does not depend on external conditions to be right to generate it. But no one wants a nuclear power plant in their backyard because they're afraid of, Chernobyl. So the result is that it would make sense that in the middle of the deep desert, you have a city-sized nuclear power plant.
So locate their fuel tanks, set them on fire, and the chain reaction will usually blow the whole ship. Do you need to know anything else? No. Is there long-term health consequences to flying a ship that knocks out the pilot each time I make a turn? Yeah, probably. But afterwards, there's a lot of burning debris and human bodies that you have to mop up before we can properly land. You're on a limited timer, and you can't save everything, or everyone, because the game will automatically try to save crew members trapped inside the debris. However, those aren't mine. I should know because I don't build evac pods on my ships.
Yeah, this is another real issue, right? Is that recovering from any disaster always involves trade-offs between searching for lives and... So here's the thing. We say, oh, well, you should always try to save lives of people in, say, debris. But if you do that, that means your crews aren't doing things like saving lives by distributing fresh water, or ensuring that power gets back up, or clearing debris so that emergency vehicles can get through, right, to people who are wounded but not trapped. So, this is sort of the nature of disasters and combat, is that your efforts have to be prioritized in really deliberate ways. And sometimes that means making really hard choices.
Think about it. The Titanic would have never crashed if it had no life vessels. If the passengers had no option for retreat, they'd plug the hole with their bloated carcasses and save the day. So instead, I switched to manual and write off those casualties as fatalities. First, we secure the fuel and munitions, because if they burn, they explode, taking our payday along with it. Then
Yep, gonna point this out. For those of you that play a little Warhammer 40k, lives are the cheapest possible thing. And material are worth several times their human lives that might use them.
check your options. Crew quarters contain souvenirs for recruiting potential allies. Captain's quarters contains clues to the location of aforementioned allies. Useful, but not essential. Radio room gives a piece of a current encryption key. Absolutely, totally, and completely worthless. If you know a single keyword, you can decrypt the entire transmission. That leaves us with the only thing that actually matters. Spare parts we can strip down and sell for money. Gun parts, missiles, radars, aircraft. Whatever it is, it's worth a lot of cash back in town.
Oh yeah, this is probably the truest part of this entire simulation. And in fact, in the war in Chechnya, right, there were, for those of you that don't know, there were actually like two Russian sort of actions in Chechnya. One in the mid-90s, in which the Russian military was pretty humiliatingly defeated by a sort of Chechen militia, police force, irregular armed force, and then another Chechen action in the early 2000s, I think like 2003 or 2, in which the Russian military absolutely shellacked the Chechens. But it was really common for, in the 90s, Chechen soldiers Russian soldiers, Russian conscripts in Chechnya, to sell parts, actually to sell military gear on the black market. They would sell rounds, they would sell their own equipment, they would sell other people's equipment, they would sell the equipment of other conscripts they coerced into giving it up. They would sell literally anything they could get their hands on. And that was driven in large part because as a Russian conscript, they were paid virtually nothing. The Russian government was broke and was struggling to not just pay their soldiers, but to actually get enough food for them to eat. So naturally, the soldiers in desperation would just sort of sell whatever they could scavenge. Of course, this had a tremendously bad effect on both military readiness when soldiers are, selling their ammunition to the enemy, and a tremendously poor effect on morale.
They got that money symbol, it's time to harvest as quickly as possible. Sometimes there's a hazard warning, which means a 50% chance of horrific accident if you don't put on protective gear. But that takes time, and I don't have a lot of time, but I do have a lot of expendable, replaceable human beings. You know what they say? You can't cook an omelet without breaking health and safety. After your profitable cleanup, you can open the hatch. Welcome to town. It's a fucking dump, but sometimes it rains. It's the only moment of serene tranquility you'll ever get in this game. Usually, there's a random event, which influences
the feast. Whoa. Around the square, a fence of tall stakes, and upon each stake is a severed human head. When you ask about the meaning of this grisly display, one of the locals eagerly explains that these are the heads of the governor's men. Not a great look.
Worldview and politics of your crew depending on how you respond. For example, your men start taking slaves from the captured enemy captives. What do you do? Option 1, slavery bad, no slavery. Option 2, slavery good, receive 5,000 credits. Option 3, slavery good, but not efficient. Assign a slavery officer to oversee and optimize slavery, receive 10,000 credits.
Bureaucratized evil, friends.
Choices are not made equal. Some are straight up better. At some point in the game,
growing cold, Piotr approaches you, preparing himself for a difficult discussion. It's getting very cold on ships. Grandu, for crew's sake, I must ask you permission to keep turbines running idle even while docked.
Rising nuclear ash keeps dropping the temperature. Your general tells you the men are freezing to death, suggesting that you keep the car engine running and burn a small amount of fuel even if you're currently parked. If you agree, temporary plus free morale bonus to all of your men, and a permanent drain on fuel supply for the rest of the game. If you say no, absolutely nothing happens. happens. It's never brought up again. Worldview is used for skill checks along the story and for charismatic negotiation with Tarkans, former Russian generals who are currently in hiding from rebel forces. Appeal to their sense of morality, give them a nice Funko Pop, and they just might join your campaign.
Yo, listen, if you can persuade an exiled general to come back, especially an exiled Russian general, historically, exiled generals who leave Mother Russia for any reason and come back, fare poorly, very poorly. So the chances that would work seem slim.
So that I can immediately sell their ship for market value. This involves giving a speech, the effect of which is specific to each character's sensibilities. Mainly, I just rant about how much I fucking hate the poor and how much money we're gonna make after we shove the gun barrel of democracy down the collective throats of a current government.
Okay, this is the truest part I've heard so far. So you can motivate regular people with talks about freedom and self-determination and living in peace and crushing their enemies. But when you talk about leaders, they're motivated by two things: their desire to stay in power and not end up with their head on a pike, and two, increasing their wealth, money, power, and prestige. This is because in order to become the leader of almost any group of people of any size and substance, you have to be just a little bit of a narcissist. And it helps a lot if you're a huge narcissist, right? Being a narcissist allows you to do the things that people with scruples would never do, right? You'll always outcompete. If you have no scruples, you will always outcompete people with scruples. So by reminding them that they're joining the winning team and that the winning team will get them paid, they are almost certain to jump on board, right? A classic, my favorite example from recent history, recent times, is that the Taliban, right, mind you, the fundamentalist Islamic insurgency that now runs Afghanistan, has partnered with China. And China's propaganda machine is actually praising the Taliban, describing them as quasi-Marxist revolutionaries or Maoist revolutionaries. The irony is that China itself is prosecuting a quasi-genocidal crackdown on their own Muslim minority. Yet, so strong is the Taliban's desire to get paid that they're willing to overlook this. They are the most remember, they're the most devoted religious fanatical government in the entire world. And their fellow Muslims are being rounded up and put into camps, and they're posing with for the cameras with old Xi Jinping and the CCP. So just goes to show you that getting paid will make you forget a lot of morally questionable things.
My impassioned speech is often very convincing. Tarkans are valuable assets, which can be called up during the campaign to ask for a small loan of 10,000, repeatedly until they no longer pick up. A city is effectively a gas station. We drop into the Gazprom depot to get scammed by shitty gas prices by some dude wearing a sack. Every gas station also comes equipped with a shipworks for ship installation and repair. You can do this undocked at low speed, but for serious repairs, you're going to have to manually land the ship. Welcome to parking, the quickest and most frequent cause of a game over. Much like jumping down a flight of stairs without legs, do not attempt to do this without landing gear. And remember to park your flagship responsibly. Sometimes it'll count balancing off a cliff as a completely valid parking spot. You'll return to the town screen only to see your flagship tumble and crash into the abyss. Also, for some reason, after parking your ship, you can still control it. You might think it's a bug, but it's never been fixed, so I suspect it's working as intended. Moving on, every gas station has an in-store self-checkout to legally purchase special munitions to be used against the same government that sold it to me. Compatibility.
That is peak Russian. As we discussed, Chechens, you could literally buy ammunition and weapons off of Russian conscripts, then go kill them with it the next day.
Depends on weapon caliber. For reference, the smallest caliber in this game is a 37mm machine gun. This goes up to 180mm, which is the size of your average artillery. And there's no option for weapon groups, so typically we fire every single gun at the same time. As far as I care, there's only two types of ammo, armor piercing and proximity fuse. The former for cutting up ships, and the latter for chopping up aircraft. The rest is a complete meme. Incendiary starts fires, which implies that 2,000 cubic tons of burning methane just wasn't enough. And laser guided lets you do this. Honestly, I really do like it, but when I remember that I'm effectively shooting money, my brow begins to sweat. And
this is okay. So this is one of the things, right? If you have the infinite money hack, which the U.S. military kind of does, is sometimes it lets you like fight in a way that is like utter nonsense, right? You can like throw these sort of very expensive widgets at problems as kind of like a gee whiz or as a goof. And it's really not a great way to run a military. And I think it, honestly, my opinion is that it stifles innovation. Like if you can spend your way out of a problem, it's sort of like who are the best and most innovative like artists and designers in the world, right? They're people that often set their style when they're sort of broke, when they say, hey, I don't have access to everything that regular people do, right? The fashion icon that's like, hey, I shop at thrift shops, right? Because they're like, they want that constraint. If you have access to everything, you're going to be able to just give yourself whatever you want. It's only when you have to operate within constraints that you start to innovate and you start to look at different ways of doing things, right? The irony, of course, is that oftentimes you come up with this idea, look at like the barn door trend of interior design, right? It's sort of a janky, you bought it at some estate sale look, and now they're like, $3,000 or whatever at Home Goods, right? They're charging you an arm and a leg. And same with like the weird high-waisted jeans, dude. They're just mom jeans. Someone just bought oversized mom jeans, but now it's like a meme and a trend. So I think the militaries operate similarly, where when you have this resource-constrained environment, you're forced to innovate. You're forced to use what you have better and differently. But if you never have that constraint, you never have to innovate. You just get to do the same thing you've always been doing, but bigger and with more guns and with more gee-whiz worthless nonsense technology.
And I start to feel nauseous. Besides that, there's a bunch of bombs, missiles, and rockets you can use to airstrike the enemy before they can even start their engines. With that out of the way, you should remember that any military campaign is largely financial, and that the most beautiful phrase in the Russian language is «Дай мне твои деньги». Пожалуйста. We are going to intercept trade convoys, murder their escort, and capture the trade ships so we can hold them for ransom. Because we're the good guys. God is with
Love this knowledge of like, and governments have this too. I mean, you look at some of the early medieval wars and, funding these campaigns, like in England, funding its campaigns against France was one of these sort of things that proved the impetus of kind of early forms of like capitalist financialization, right? You would create these instruments of like, hey, I'm going to raise money on the promise that I will sack some French castles and give you back more, right? And so this idea that instead of just taxing their landholders, right, when they taxed them all to death, then they got to turn to merchants. The king was like, okay, you can loan me money and we'll pay it back. And that was the start of this idea of funding profitable ventures for a return down the road. Obviously, we've turned this into a gamified military version of this, where someone, will actually loan you money to go hit convoys, and then you come back with even more riches.
With us on this campaign, and thus piracy is absolutely ethical, encouraged, and the best way of making money, hands down, besides selling ballistic nuclear weapons on the open market. Speaking of ballistic nuclear weapons, why haven't we used them yet? Because, as your general puts it, once the genie's out of the bottle, it's never going back inside. But I'm okay with that, because I only have one wish to make. I wish for a nuclear winter. The death of one is a tragedy, but the death of millions is a good start. However, in retrospect, this wasn't the best idea. You see, we didn't use them because we couldn't. We didn't use them because they have more than us. Considerably more. And right now, They're heading towards us. So, word of advice, they won't touch the button as long as you don't. You can start the nuclear war, but they're going to finish it.
Yeah, this is those of you that don't know, mutually assured destruction, right? And this is why there's a sort of, in modern nuclear deterrence theory, there's like a minimum necessary number to achieve deterrence, right? So like North Korea, for example, if they have one nuclear weapon, well, that's actually their minimum number because Seoul is right next door. And so it is the largest city in North Korea. So you need to hit one target to effectively deter other nuclear powers. Even though the US has tens of thousands, right? It almost doesn't matter. So similarly, when you look at countries like China, who have a modernizing nuclear arsenal and of a few hundred weapons, but that's all that is needed. Because again, you could name a few hundred targets, especially if they were major cities, and you could say, hey, we've worked through basically all of the... you could hit every major US metro area with 50 nuclear weapons. So 100 is every major metro area plus every major military installation, right? So again, 100 or 200 or 300 is enough to achieve nuclear deterrence, even if your enemy has 1,000 nuclear weapons, right? Anyway, that's the sort of thinking now. So in this case, right, you're able to stop them from using nukes with your much smaller arsenal because it still is dangerous enough that they don't want to get stung. Sort of like you won't mess with a beehive, not because you are less powerful than a bee, but because getting stung is annoying enough to get you to stop.
Finally, if you actually want to win the game, pre-built ships aren't good enough. You have to make your own. You do this by clicking Shipworks in the main menu. Unfortunately, the latest patch has removed the background sound effects because somebody kept complaining. Luckily, I still have my old copy, so I can still tune in to the soothing ASMR of a Middle Eastern repair shop. Here's some of the projects I made after stealing and taking credit for them from a friend. The block, the brick, the cock and ball accelerator, which generates torque directly from the phallus, the box, the Death Star of David, work in progress, the windmill of friendship, footage
Yikes.
missing, the fly swatter, also known as the make shit crash, because enemies will desperately try to avoid mid-air collision, which instead makes them crash into the ground. The when you run out of ammo, you become the ammo, the why did I make this, and many more. Eventually, I realized that armor plates are functionally no different to reinforced hull pieces, except they weigh 3 times as much. So I made this abomination. It can take out every strike fleet in the game back to back with no breaks. I can literally sit in the first town, wait until Grandma calls the Gestapo, and watch as the entire rebel military explode in front of me. I
love it. Love it. This is the kind of innovative thinking, again, that militaries can get to when you're constrained by a bunch of stuff, right? There was this whole campaign in which he played conventionally, which he played it straight, right? Using the conventional tactics, and only when you have this resource constraint, when you're underpowered, under-equipped, and fighting is just so hard, do you look at ways to innovate? And this is what you're talking about. He's like, hey, whole pieces, functionally the same as heavy armor plating, but they're cheaper, more efficient. So why don't we just, instead of trying to protect our ship from any damage, just build layers and layers of lightweight armor that's supposed to get destroyed? These sort of questioning of assumptions is totally characteristic of a military that is trying to fight a war under a really constrained environment against a larger opponent.
love this game, which brings me to my main critique. There's not enough, and I want more. It's like a slice of cake that I want, but I can't have, because I can't legally imprison the developer until he bakes the aforementioned cake. Unless I somehow invite him over on false pretenses, burn his passport, and cuff him to the work table. Hypothetically, of course. Also, if you're worried...
Seth is an increasingly bizarre man. He's played a lot of these, like, sociopath games. That's it. He loves sociopath games. Games where you have no moral character. And I think it's bleeding into his real life. And I'm a little worried.
Worried about epilepsy? Just know that modern copies of a game have been sanitized for your delicate eyes. You can set your preference in the options menu. Thanks to all the seizure complaints, Glitch High is now just a bunch of fuzzy lines. But on release, Glitch High was the equivalent of burning out your cornea with a radioactive lens flare. It was actually even funnier because the options used to be flipped. So you'd set it to Glitch Low, which would actually be Glitch High, and very soon, both your retinas would cease to function.
Wow. Yeah, I already have a headache.
And die. If you're interested, you can grab a copy on Steam, or you can physically steal it by cutting the fiberglass cables outside your house and intercepting the individual packets of light. As always, more content to come, hopefully more often, so stay tuned. A warm thanks to the many members of the Merchants Guild generously funding and bankrolling these videos. You're all truly wonderful. Have a good one.
Okay, wow. All right, guys. That was actually pretty wild. I actually was really into that. Okay, so I want to break down a little bit more about this sort of era, right? The Cold War in general. And what you have here is what happens when you have like emerging technologies, right? And these technologies, the Cold War was weird for a bunch of reasons, right? Because there was never actually the hot conventional war. There was only sort of guerrilla wars. And so the militaries had to guess at what the other one was going to do at a given time. So the US would sit there in the immediate aftermath of World War II and say, okay, well, we think the Soviets are going to want to drive tanks through Europe. So they said, okay, well, we're going to stop them with nuclear weapons. We're going to put bombers on bases around that area. And then the Soviets got their own nuclear weapons, and they said, okay, well, we think the US has these bombers around the bases, and so they could strike our cities, they could strike our military installations, or they could strike actual formations of tanks. So they got their own bombers, and they targeted them towards cities, and it escalated, right? So on and so forth. But it was all just guesswork. It was, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think they could be thinking by designing a new tank? What does that mean? Well, the new tank is faster and more mobile. Okay, well, maybe that means that they're planning on launching a strong counterattack, right? And the only way to learn anything was actually through some of these proxy wars, some of which were not very good proxies. For example, the Vietnam War, where a pretty unconventional, lightly armed and armored military force opposed the very powerful conventional U.S. force. So that's not a good analogy for like the Soviet Union tanks rolling over Europe. But the Iran-Iraq War might have been a great example of how that would have gone. Again, they were equipped with modern technology and were roughly evenly matched after the U.S. sold the right people the right amount of weapons. But because they were evenly matched, we got to see what these sort of what this war looks like. And the answer in the Iran-Iraq War was vicious, just like vicious and brutal trench warfare. Truly, truly awful. So it meant that, but again, is that a proxy for what a US-Soviet war would have looked like? And we learned recently through some declassified documents that while the US was like committed to only using nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear strike, and if they did it, it would be only an all-out strike, right? There was no half-measured use of nuclear weapons. It meant that the Soviets had no such compunction. We now see some of their speculative plans for invading Europe, and they would have dropped tactical nukes on day one. So it would have probably triggered, whether they realized it or not, probably triggered a nuclear exchange that would have, kind of ended the world. So we should be glad the Soviets never rolled into Europe and that we never tried to roll back communism in Europe. Okay, actually, there's like 4 minutes of this video, guys. Let's see what I'm missing. Is this all the patrons? Whoa, he has a lot of patrons. Oh my god. Holy smokes. Dude, I need this many Patreons. That's what I need. What am I doing in my life? Wow. Okay, guys. Yeah, check out Space Station 13. That's another good one. Okay. 4 straight minutes of Patreon.
Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran,
What the hell?
MMA fighter,
What the hell is this
YouTuber.
playing? There we go. Yeah. No, don't need to do that now. Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the heart of whatever this game is. This is actually the most playable game I've seen Seth review so far. Let me know if you guys want to see other Seth videos. Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe. And next time, I'll see you guys later.